Okay, so today I'm going to just finish up a couple of slides of the Filipino American experience and we'll move on to the second generation issues. So I think the last time we were talking about the importance and the significance of the Filipino American communities, particularly in California, with a focus on their involvement in agriculture. They will eventually make history throughout the 1950s and 1960s when they would join hands with one of the most significant and largest United Farm Workers in the state of California, and their activism during that time period would fundamentally change the manner in which the US government deals with agricultural laborers in not only California, but throughout the United States. I wanted to begin with the development of FALA, which we talked about last time, Filipino American Labor Association in 1939. And even prior to 1939, there were a series of strikes in the state of California that demonstrated their rising sort of power and significance as labor union workers in agriculture. During this time period, about 7,000 men and women employed in the lettuce and packing sheds in Salinas, California, struck, and they were able to completely shut down the lucrative industry, and the union's demands were soon granted. In 1939, FALA again won its major victory with a successful strike of the asparagus industry in other industries as well. It prompted other victories in the celery, Brussels sprouts, garlic fields. All of these are really labor intensive agricultural work areas in which thousands of Filipino Americans worked as laborers in California. By 1940, there were nearly 30,000 FALA members. So this is a very significant fact, right? A decade later, moving on to the 1950s, there were several key Filipino organizers, leaders within the community really spearheaded the farm labor movement of the 1950s and beyond. One person in particular is a person by the name of Larry Itliong, and he was a key organizer and he became the vice president of the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, which would join hands with the United Farm Workers. Most of you should be familiar with United Farm Workers. Cesar Chavez, of course, became the president of the United Farm Workers, and they were able to embrace large numbers of the Filipino American agricultural workers, and they were able to join hands and develop the United Farm Workers. So AWOC was the organization that Filipinos had been involved, and Cesar Chavez, his own labor union joined hands and established the United Farm Workers. This is the symbol of the United Farm Workers. The eagle represents the Mexican flag. This part here is the inverted Aztec pyramid. The white background here represents hope, and black represents struggle, and red sacrifice. So this is the flag of the United Farm Workers. Cesar Chavez wrote an open letter to the grape industry during that time period that really sort of captures many of the struggles of the farm workers during this time period. He writes, "We are men and women who have suffered and endured much, and not only because of our abject poverty, but because we have been kept poor. The color of our skins, the languages of our cultural and native origins, the lack of formal education, the exclusion from the democratic process, the numbers of our slain in recent wars, all these burdens, generation after generation, have sought to demoralize us, to break our human spirit. But God knows we are not beasts of burden. We are not agricultural implements or rented slaves. we are men. And this is the fact that many of our politicians oftentimes forget that when we bring workers to work in California's agriculture or in other areas, we think that they're just economic implements. But when in fact they are just like all of us as human beings with needs and feelings and all emotions and other kinds of human needs. In reflecting on the complexities that make up the experience of the Filipinos in America, I mentioned there was a very prominent author by the name of Carlos Bulasan, and he wrote a book titled America is in the Heart. And I'm going to just briefly read a couple of passages from this book that I think captures some of the feelings that many Filipino Americans and other Americans who have immigrated to this country and adopted this land as their new home, I think all share these common sentiments. And I think these words are very powerful, which I wanted to share with you. So he writes in the book what he thinks of what America is, right? And he writes, America is not a land of one race or one class of men. We are all Americans that have toiled and suffered and know oppression and defeat. From the first Indian that offered peace in Manhattan to the last Filipino pea pickers. America is not bound by geographical latitudes. America is not merely a land or an institution. America is in the hearts of men that died for freedom. It is also in the eyes of men that are building a new world. America is a prophecy of a new society of men, of a system that knows no sorrow or strife or suffering. America is a warning to those who would try to falsify the ideals of free men. He goes on. America is also the nameless foreigner, the homeless refugee, the hungry boy begging for a job, and the black body dangling from a tree. America is the illiterate immigrant who is ashamed that the world of books and intellectual opportunities is closed to him. We are all that nameless foreigner, that homeless refugee, that hungry boy, that illiterate immigrant, and that lynched black body. All of us, from the first Adams to the last Filipino, native born or alien, educated or illiterate, we are America. This is the picture of Carlos Bolasan, who died, very young. He was only about 43 years old. Let me pause here and see if you have any comments or questions pertaining to particularly Carlos Bolasan's reflection on what America is. I think those words are really powerful. And really, it resonated with me so much. I think that people try to understand America in very simplistic terms. And a lot of times history is told in such a black and white way. But I think that just by looking at the experiences of Asians in America, you can readily see that it's a complex history. We have had very difficult experiences that impacted so many of ethnic and racial groups in America. But at the same time, it holds tremendous amount of, I think, promise. And there is a great deal of optimism when it comes to thinking about what America means for all of us. So I wanted to kind of, you know, reflect that, reflect on that just a little bit, and then we can move on. Okay, so what do you say? What are your thoughts regarding what Carlos Bulasan had to say about what America is, and how does it resonate with you? How do you sort of understand what America is, and would you be able to, I guess, write those words if you were to thinking about the meaning of America in the way that you understand it?
I think that Carlos Bulasan wrote what America is in a very like encompassing just like whole way.
Hmm.
I also see, America as not necessarily not that accepting. I don't think many people would consider those type of people to be completely American, especially since
Hmm.
it's such a political topic. Not to say that I don't want all of what he wrote to be considered American. I
Hmm.
think what he wrote is like the idealistic version, but I think that the reality of what people experience and it is different, I guess.
Yes, clearly throughout history, many of the ethnic and racial groups in America experienced all kinds of discrimination, violence, death, extermination, internment. All of those things are clearly very prominent aspects of their experience. And we can never forget about those experiences, right? But I think he is also saying something else as well. While he may be somewhat optimistic in his view of America, I think the title of his book, which says America is in the heart, I think calls us to think about what America is, not in the traditional sense of how people think of what America or what American is.
It's like despite the fact that these people are treated differently or badly, that they are still American in their values and in their hopes and dreams.
Hmm. So, in the beginning of the semester, when I teach this class, Asian American History, I ask students to help define what America is, or what is an American, or who is an American. And it's interesting to hear how people initially think about what America is. And most of us, we really don't think about its meaning in a deep, sort of reflective way. But there's a tendency, especially in the mainstream American society, to think about America in its visual manifestations, right? What we see and experience, rather than the content of what it really means. And this is related to the second generation dilemma that we are going to talk about in just a few moments, in terms of the clear difference between the experience of the first generation immigrants and the second generation, the distinction between race and culture, how that um, has been an important part of how we understand and think about what America is. And as a consequence, we've had all kinds of policies that were, rooted in race rather than the content of people's character. There's an interesting sort of parallel between what Carlos Bolson is saying about what America means in a substantive way, and how the second generation children of immigrants experience as Americans, culturally speaking, in American society. So we'll kind of tease those issues out a little bit more when we discuss the second generation dilemma. If we were to think about the second generation dilemma, right, relative to the immigrant generation or the first generation parents, if we could analytically highlight the distinctions or differences in terms of their experiences, how could we do that?
So the first generations, like the immigrants that straight up come from Asia directly to America,
Mm-hmm.
and like they're like the first ones here. Obviously, they're like they they still like speak a different language. Oftentimes, they like have to assimilate here, like many other immigrants from around the world. And then the second generations, like typically their children, which are like born on American soil and like have a much easier um, chance like adapting and assimilating to American society.
Mm-hmm.
So those are like the general overview of like those two generations. So
Mm-hmm. So, Peter, you mentioned that your parents came from Vietnam. Is that correct?
yeah, yeah,
And
that's correct.
how do you identify yourself?
So that's a long story, but I'll just like keep this
It's a
fast.
long story for many of us, for sure.
So when I was growing up, I had a hard time to like decide what identity I want to be Vietnamese or
I'm
Asian
sorry,
or
we couldn't hear
American.
you well.
Oh, um, when I was like growing up, I had like a hard time to like choose what identity I wanted to be.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, should I be American? Should I be Asian or Vietnamese or all
Mm-hmm.
of them? Um, it was like at first I wanted to be like straight up like whitewashed American
Mm-hmm.
because I thought it was better. But then as time grew on, I like matured and understood and like appreciate my family's traditions and culture. So I
Mm-hmm.
decided that of both worlds, um, Vietnamese and American, Vietnamese American was like the best for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided to like identify myself with like that hybrid label.
Mm.
So it's like easy for me to connect with the two cultures, my parents' generation and the American one. So yeah.
Yeah, and your dilemma is, believe it or not, shared by millions of others. And they raise, I think, very similar questions about, who am I? Am I, um, you know, do I sort of adapt the culture of my parents? So, do I act like Vietnamese? Or am I in the United States, since people can't really distinguish between Vietnamese and other Asian ethnic groups, am I just an Asian? Or do I become, in your words, whitewashed American, right? I don't know exactly what that means, right? But I can uh, understand where you're coming from, right? And it really raises an important question about social and personal identity of many Asian Americans, right, in quotes, who experience all kinds of dissonances because of their Asian ethnic identity, trying to sort of navigate the challenging and difficult, social and cultural spaces in America that does not necessarily sort of honor or recognize Asian American experience, right? And the important issue here is the difference between culture and race, right? And I wanted to have a conversation about that a little bit more shortly. But I want us to kind of think about a little bit more the dilemma that the second generation Asian Americans in particular face. But this is something that can be applied also to other populations as well, right? And I wanted to make the connection to the analysis of what culture is, what race is, and how those factors actually mediate the content of the experiences of the second generation children of immigrants, right?
I feel like what was similar, the first generation, they had to, well, the first and second generation, they had to ask themselves, who are they? The first generation being that they moved from an Asian country to the United States and had to assimilate. So having to ask themselves, okay, well, having to add in all these American um, traditions or culture, whatever, they had to ask themselves, who are they now? And then the second generation, I believe, like had to do that as well because they were like, well, I live in America, but America's taught something else, and my family comes from another background. So I think that's one big connection between the two.
is the first generation's dilemma qualitatively different than the second generation?
I would have to say yes, being that they had to assimilate and change a lot more than
Mhm.
the second generation, since they were born on American soil and they grew up around um, that different culture.
Mhm.
So I would have to say yes.
Mhm. So the important point for us to kind of remember here, I think, is that when when you reflect on the experiences of the first generation, um, regardless of where they came from, right? Whether they came from Asia or Europe or Africa or some other places, right? And particularly if you come from places where English is not your first language, right? All of these first generation immigrant populations undergo very similar processes, right? In terms of uh, because for most of them, they came to America in order to search for better opportunities, whether those are economic, political opportunities, or other kinds of opportunities that the United States presented them with. And so, the immigrant generation is very sort of motivated to do well, to succeed economically or otherwise, and they're willing to work in occupations that many Americans are not simply willing to do, or they would rather move into other areas that are much more comfortable and that require less amount of physical labor, etc. Right? And so a lot of the first generation immigrant populations, we hear all kinds of stories about their struggles of trying to make it in American society. And at the same time, they will also encounter a number of obstacles because of their lack of cultural understanding regarding what living in America entails. They are likely not going to be American citizens immediately. So during that time period, they will struggle because of the fact that they are not American citizens. So there are some legal issues. And also, culturally speaking, they will encounter issues pertaining to whether or not they will be socially accepted. But first generation immigrant populations generally tend to stick to themselves. They create, generally speaking, ethnic enclaves or communities in which they will take care of most of their needs, including such things as housing or employment or even social and religious activities. They tend to attend immigrant churches. They will establish networks that are based on their immigrant or ethnic identification, right? So a lot of those things are very common across many of the ethnic population, immigrant populations, the first generation that come to the United States. The interesting sort of difference is that when it comes to the second generation, for Asian Americans and other ethnic populations, they are, for all practical purposes, Americans, culturally speaking, because their first language most likely is going to be English, and they will also, they will matriculate into American school system where there is going to be a lot of socialization taking place. They will learn to become Americans through their friends, through their involvement in school activities, and they then begin to distance themselves from their first generation parents because they will now acquire more American taste, American ideals, and cultural practices, social mores, all of those things. These are the contents that make up an individual identity, right? Or individual person. What they look like is very different than how they sort of, how they feel inside, right? Even though they wear the racial uniform that Professor Takaki talks about, that is indistinguishable from their first generation immigrant parents. In terms of the content of the second generation, they are, for all practical purposes, Americans, right? The dilemma comes in because even though they are inside, right? Uh, just as Carlos Bulloson talked about how this notion of America is in the heart, the content of individuals, the second generation feel like they're Americans, culturally speaking, but they are not treated as Americans, right? And so there is this dissonance between how they feel and how they experience the world because of the preponderance of race, in particular, in American society. And especially this applies to the second generation whose racial sort of identity is not in conformity with the dominant racial identity of American society, right? And so this notion that even though you have been living in the United States all your life, you could be still perceived as not quite American. You're still perceived as a foreigner, right? And this experience goes on for this, exceeds beyond the second generation into the third generation, fourth generation, as long as we have in our imagination who is believed to be an authentic, true American, right, in terms of race. As long as that is sustained in the social psyche of American society, then a lot of these groups that are not sort of part of that mainstream American imagination, they will continue to experience otherization, social marginalization. And so, therein lies the dilemma of the second generation, right? So even though the broad sort of spectrum of American ideals embraces all people from all over the world, in practice, that has not been the case, right? We still experience social othering or discrimination on the basis of their racial background. And, that's the continuing sort of saga of American society. Unfortunately, we still view each other in terms of not who they are in their hearts, but what they look like on the outside, right? And this causes all kinds of issues, identity issues for the second generation, particularly Asian Americans. And Peter had mentioned that, this myth called the model minority myth, which in many ways, I think helps to explain some of the stereotypes pertaining to Asian Americans. And there's a political dimension to Asian Americans being perceived as a model minority. It's an analytical sort of a framework that was developed in the 1980s as a way of essentially putting down other racial minorities who had tried to assert their rights as Americans through protests. And they perceived that Asian Americans have succeeded without having to really sort of protest. What that meant basically was that America presented plenty of opportunities for people who are willing to work hard. Look at Asian Americans, they have done well. Peter was able to also talk about how this is a myth because Asian American communities are incredibly diverse communities. And to think that all Asian Americans are doing well is far from the fact. And there are significant sort of inequities or differences that exist within Asian American communities.
I know that you explained like the reasoning behind the model minority myth, but is there like a point in time exactly where it came about, or yeah, just like how it originated, I guess?
Yeah, throughout the 1980s and early part of the 1990s, there was a major sort of social debate, but its roots go back to the 1960s during the height of the civil rights movement as well. right? But mass media began to pick this up in the 1980s and 1990s when Asian American students in particular were doing very well and were enrolling in major flagship universities throughout the United States. And some of the census data also showed how Asian American families have done well, economically speaking. And this was a time period when we were also debating major social welfare programs. Other sort of racial groups were not doing very well relative to Asian Americans in totality, right? Without taking into consideration of the fact that there are many Asian ethnic populations that were struggling at that time. In fact, their rate of poverty, people who occupy the lower economic status, have been sort of taken out of the conversation altogether and exclusively focused on those Asian Americans that have done well, right, economically and in terms of education. And so Asian Americans were used in the 1980s and 1990s as a way of basically rebuffing some of those other racial minorities who were challenging the American social and economic system that essentially and systematically discriminated against. So that's the context. 1980s, I would say 1980s and 1990s was the time period in which Asian Americans were, held up as a model for other racial minority groups in order to underscore the argument that in American society, opportunities are plentiful and that social discrimination or economic discrimination do not exist to the level that people have been complaining about. And they were saying, look at Asian Americans. They were able to overcome many of these challenges because they were willing to work hard. Okay. So I wanted to introduce a theory that some of you may be familiar with. And this is a theory developed by a sociologist by the name of Robert E. Park. And this is a theory of assimilation. Robert E. Park came up with this theory in the 1920s when there were a significant number of immigrant populations that were coming into the United States during this time period. And as a society, we were concerned about whether or not these various immigrant populations would successfully assimilate into American society. And he postulated that what he would refer to as the race relations cycle, that immigrant populations go through certain sort of stages of adaptation and ultimately assimilation into American society. And this cycle or stages consist of four major sort of parts. The first is the contact experience, and that's pretty obvious in that when immigrant populations enter the United States, they will come into contact with the host society, where they will inevitably enter into the second stage of conflict. There will be numerous types of conflicts ranging from cultural conflicts, because many of them will not have been exposed to the American culture, the social mores. Many of them will come to the United States not being able to speak the English language. And other aspects of cultural and economic sort of dissonances or differences will present these immigrant populations with major challenge and conflicts. Now, over time, however, both the immigrant population and the host society will learn to live with each other. They will learn to accommodate, and it may take some time for some ethnic populations more than some other ethnic populations, but over time, generally speaking, they will learn to live with each other, and the incidence of conflict over time will go down. And by the second generation and third generation, many of these ethnic populations will have assimilated successfully, culturally speaking, and also many of the second and third generation will have structurally, by structure, I mean economically or otherwise, they will have been integrated into various structures of American society. So this is very, in a simplistic sort of way, Robert E. Park describes how immigrant populations, and by the second and third generations, these immigrant populations and their children will have successfully assimilated it into American society. This is all well and good. I think that for many immigrant ethnic populations, the theory applies very well. But this is not a perfect theory because it also, if we apply it to Asian Americans in particular, I think there's a important debate that can be had about whether or not Asian Americans have successfully, both in terms of culture and structure, assimilated into American society. And this is then tied to the second generation dilemma that we talked about shortly, a little bit earlier. In his theory, he kind of talked about the meaning of America in a similar way that Carlos Bulasan talked about how America is in the heart. And he distinguished between superficial uniformity versus deep assimilation. And this difference is quite informative in terms of how we understand what America is or should be for all of us. And he says that it is relatively easy for people to take over the language, the manners, the social ritual, and outward forms of adopted country, right? So these things are all cultural things, right? We can apply ourselves to learn the language and the manners and the social rituals. And we learn how to sort of pick up the social cues that um, serve as the glues for how American society sort of functions, right? And other outer forms of the adapted country. But he says the likeness, right, where we become assimilated to these kinds of outward forms of cultures is purely a formal concept, which is of itself cannot hold anything together. It's not something that is strong enough for us to build a society that has organic sort of solidarity or bonds that would keep us together. Instead, he says a society must focus on the aims, the attitudes, sentiments, and ideals that ensure unity. And this is precisely what Carlos Bolasan talked about in the passage that we read earlier in the book America is in the Heart. It has to be what is inside our heart, and not these kinds of likenesses, right, that are based on the outer appearances, right? What matters is the content of a character. What matters is what is inside of us, the aims, the attitudes, sentiments, and ideals. The former, which is the superficial uniformity, can be copied and used, while the latter must be appreciated and understood, right? You have to really believe in it, right? You have to really appreciate the meaning behind some of these aims and attitudes and sentiments and ideals. The former, it can be copied and used, but it's very superficial. So given this definition, what factors would facilitate assimilation of immigrants and citizens, and how can we assess the experience of Asians in America? Well, these are questions that we are going to turn to, but let me just comment on how the second generation Asian Americans have assimilated. So culturally speaking, they have done quite a bit of adaptation or assimilation in the way Robert E. Park talked about the superficial uniformity. They learn to adapt to American way of life through the language, through the schooling, the clothing that they wear, even some of the customs and values of being an American citizen or living in American society. However, many of the Asian Americans have experienced social segregation in the form of housing and work and community and opportunities. And they were politically also, in many ways, marginalized because they were not allowed to vote or hold public offices or public employment for a very long period of time in American society. What is one issue that continues to present a challenge for Asian Americans is the fact that they are still wearing this racial uniform that most of Americans still see as an important, identity marker in American society. It still matters that you are distinguished on the basis of how you look, and that continues to plague social relations. It still presents major challenges for their ability to go to schools, particularly in universities, and also in their effort to not only gain employment, but also to move up the economic social ladder once they are employed in particular sort of corporations or other areas. So these are some of the ongoing sort of challenges that many of the second generation Asian Americans continue to face. Now, I'm going to, as I mentioned, there is a key difference between the first and second generation in terms of the distinction between race and culture. And so maybe we could talk a little bit about what those differences are in terms of when we think about culture versus race. Let me ask you a question about how you understand what culture is. Let's begin there, analytically speaking, and then make comparison to race as well.
I think a big part of culture is the values that the group that you belong to hold. So, like, there's
And the values.
what kind of values?
Mm-hmm. What are some examples of values?
They could be like religious values that are commonly shared, maybe attitudes toward like familial structures or relations, attitudes toward like education and work.
I think for me, probably what would represent cultural values are like music, the styles of music, dance, religion, language, political ideologies, maybe. Like they don't define them, but sometimes I think countries kind of become like agree on a political ideology that like fits their country, depending. But yeah.
Yeah. So if we were to define culture a little more analytically, it refers to things that we acquire in the course of life. So language is something that we acquire through education, for instance. Education itself is something that we acquire as well. We were not born educated. We were not born speaking a particular language. Religion is another form of culture in that it's something that we acquire in the course of life. We were not born with a particular religious identity. Whatever the identity that we had, that's probably a reflective of our parents' religious background, right? But once we have consciousness, and also once we develop and mature, and we are able to make independent sort of decisions, the idea that when we become a Christian or Muslim or Sikh or Buddhist happens during the course of our life. It's something that we acquire. Now, culture is different from race in that race is something that cannot be changed over time, right? I cannot change how I look as long as we define race in terms of our physical traits. When people assign values to that, something that cannot be changed, it becomes problematic because it doesn't really matter how much effort that I put in to change who I am. My racial sort of background is not going to change. And unfortunately, throughout American history, we've had policies that were based on people's racial background rather than their culture, rather than their ability to assimilate or adapt or acquire things that are culturally important as an American in this society, right? So that's the key distinction between culture and race. The relevance of this for the second generation dilemma is the fact that culturally speaking, the second generation, third generation were Americans, right? They have acquired all of those things that were very important to be American citizens. But what is even more important is not so much that they're able to speak the language or they have acquired social mores of being an American citizen, but what truly matters, as articulated by Robert E. Park and Carlos Bulasan, is actually the things that are commonly sort of shared inside, right? Those sentiments, right? Those ideals that make up who we are as true Americans. And so somebody once said that Benedict Arnold was just was an American in name only, but he was a traitor to American society. For many of the groups that are perceived as not quite Americans by the mainstream American society, when in fact many Asian Americans wholeheartedly believe in some of those ideals that really make up what it means to be an American. And so, these are important distinctions that we have to, understand in order to sort of make sense of where the points of difficulties lie in terms of trying to sort of move forward as a society, right? We have to be able to make sort of assessments or judgments on the basis of who people are inside. If we were to look at Carlos Bolasan, many people would say, yeah, he's not quite American. He's not, typically speaking, the mainstream American. And yet, inside, he truly believed in the complexities of belonging in American society. He believed in those ideals, those sentiments that really make up what it means to be an American in our society, right? So that's the key issues that I wanted to kind of highlight regarding the second generation dilemma, what it means to be an American in the way Robert E. Park and people like Carlos Bolasan kind of thought through a long time ago, right? And I think those points and perspectives are still very much relevant in American society today. We still see people through the lens of race, and unfortunately, that colors how we understand each other, ourselves, and it causes all kinds of issues for people who are perceived as not quite American. A lot of the second generation, third generation Asian Americans encounter these identity issues because of the dissonance that exists, right? The dissonance being that culturally speaking, they are Americans and yet they are not perceived as 100% Americans. And so, that I think underlies a lot of the, social and identity issues many Asian Americans continue to encounter in the present context.